Hi everyone, welcome to Ainslee Hooper Chats and this week I have Jason Clymo with me. Welcome Jason, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Me too, very, very excited. Jason, can you please introduce yourself and tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Yep, so I'm Jason Clymo, as you said, and I do a lot of different things actually.
Mm-hmm.
I work at a museum in marketing. I run my own business, which is a marketing agency. I'm also a model
Mm-hmm.
and a activist. So I'm a person with disability, and I have a spinal cord injury, and I wheel myself around in my cool little all black wheelchair.
Excellent. Can you tell me about the modelling?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe, well, I think it was about 3 years ago now, or 3.5 maybe, I started modelling, and
Mm-hmm.
I model with an agency called Wink Models in Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty cool. And I just sort of jumped straight into it really because I have a friend that works in the industry down in Melbourne,
Mm-hmm.
and she just suggested, do you want to give it a go? And I was like, oh yeah, cool. Didn't really even think about like the activism or inclusion or diversity side of things at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much I was like quite shallow about it. I was like, this would be a fun way to travel Australia or the world and make some money and have some fun and meet some cute people along the way,
Mm-hmm.
some nice looking boys.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, probably after doing it for about maybe 3 months, I was contacted by an organization called Starting with Julius,
Right.
and they sort of opened my eyes to the world of inclusion, and sort of made me realize that what I was doing was a little bit groundbreaking in terms of being signed by a modeling agency, being a person with disability.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously now I'm like full blown in my activism and inclusion work and everything that I really try and do in terms of my modeling. Obviously sometimes it's just incidental stuff and I'm making money, which is nice, and it's fun, but most of the time there is an element of activism attached, and it's about breaking down the barriers in fashion and advertising
Mm-hmm.
industries,
Mm-hmm.
and getting better representation and more representation for people
Mm-hmm.
with disability. So
Right. So
yeah.
with Wink, is that a an agency for people with disabilities, or it just happens?
No, so they're a
No,
mainstream
mainstream. Yep.
mainstream modeling agency
Yep.
down in Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that was sort of almost the groundbreaking part about it, was that I don't believe at that point in time, like 3 or 4 years ago, whatever it was,
Mm.
that there were other models with disability signed to those mainstream agencies. There are obviously other
Wow.
models with disability modeling, but yeah, the agencies have a very big role to play in actually getting representation um, and almost educating their own clients about representing people from marginalized communities. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a bit of a big deal, and I
Yeah.
just didn't realize.
That is, yeah, man, that's awesome. I mean, I've not looked into that space too much, so I would have assumed just straight away that it would have been, yeah, for people with disabilities. But that, and that's an interesting thought process for someone with a disability to have. So it's, yeah, it's great to see that exists. So
Yeah.
were you doing modeling before your spinal cord injury?
No, I'd sort of
Okay.
considered it once or twice
Mm.
before, but I ended up actually studying medicine for 2 years,
Yes.
prior to acquiring my impairment.
Mm.
And that sort of just took over my life, I guess. So yeah, modeling was just like, oh, maybe I'll do that one day. And then I started studying med, and I was like, I do not have time to do anything else. So
Right.
yeah,
Wow.
and then I obviously didn't follow that through.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, now that I've got a bit more of that time on my hands, I guess, not that I'm pretty busy again, but
Sorry, you're pretty what? Sorry.
busy
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah, with my different bits and pieces, which is
Mm.
great. I love it.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So is the modeling, is that the main income that you're having, like the main income stream?
Probably more my day job at the museum and my business is
Okay.
where like
Yeah.
most of the money comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the modeling and inclusion work is
Yeah.
probably where my heart lies, my
Yeah.
passion lies, really.
I've got to ask you, what are you doing at the museum? I'm
Oh,
an
I do marketing.
anthropologist. Oh, marketing. I'm an
Yeah,
anthropologist, so the whole museum thing just, yeah, but absolutely geeking out. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Yeah, so it's a what's called, yeah, it's more like it interprets like our local history here in where I live in the town of Chuka. So it's about like the river history and paddle
Mhm.
steamers, things like that. So it's quite cool, and we run guided tours and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
nice. Yeah,
yeah,
I remember I went there a few years ago. It was a Tutankhamun exhibit. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and yeah, it was amazing. And I remember going there a few years before that. This was the
yeah,
Melbourne Museum, I think it was, and yeah, seeing the Charles Darwin display that was amazing. Yeah, absolutely
yeah,
loved it. Yeah. So I was so talking about the medicine side of things.
yeah,
Because I remember reading in blog articles of yours, and yet learning about the fact that you were studying medicine. And you said when you were studying medicine that you'd studied, this was before your spinal cord injury happened, that you were studying medicine and you were studying disability at the time.
yeah.
Can you go into that a bit more? Because that was fascinating to me.
Yeah. I think what you're referring to is I think I did an interview at one point, and I said in the interview, it's true that in med we were learning about not specifically around disability. There needs to be a lot more of that in medicine and health fields, education around that, and education around like social model of disability and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what we were learning about was the nervous system, and
Yeah.
so we learnt about spinal cord injuries. And I remember learning about quadriplegia and paraplegia, and basically just thinking to myself, I'd rather die than
Mm-hmm.
have that or have my life look like this.
Mm.
So obviously this was when I was non-disabled and just very
Yes.
ignorant. And, you know, that's a lot of sort of ableism and internalized ableism,
Mm-hmm.
really, that I've now processed. And obviously now I've realized like how dare I think that, really, because look at my life now, and I love my life probably tenfold more now than I
Mm-hmm.
did back then. So yeah, I've grown a lot since
Mm-hmm.
that point in my life. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's a very interesting thing that I do like to talk about and reflect on, because it shows that growth. It shows that even people with disability, especially people who have acquired impairments, it's like
Mm-hmm.
we were non-disabled people who
Mm-hmm.
were potentially very ignorant and ableist beforehand,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, could still be quite ignorant and ableist now as well. Like internalized ableism is a thing, like it's
Mm-hmm.
massive. So
Yeah.
um and sometimes it does come from outside, because it can be, and most of the time it is really,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like the portrayals and the representation and like the inaccessibility and all that kind of stuff that we see in the real world that often dictates our own perceptions of ourselves. So
Yeah.
that's that's a complicated conversation, but yeah,
Mm.
I do like talking about that because it shows that progress and that growth that non-disabled people can have themselves
Mm.
without actually acquiring an impairment. They can change and grow their
Yeah.
minds and change their own perception of disability. So
Because that was the fascinating thing to me, because I mean, I've I was born with spina bifida, so I've known no different. I mean, I used to
yeah,
use a frame and calipers to walk around on when I was a kid, and then when I got, I don't know, early teens, I had to have a spinal fusion, and because of curvature of the spine, and
yeah,
then at that point I had to go get physio if I wanted to start going back into the calipers and frame. And I was at the age where I was just like, nah, too hard work. I don't want to do that.
yeah,
So I just want to, I was like, nah, that's too much. I didn't want to have to go to get all, have all the sessions. So I just stayed in the wheelchair, but so for me, like I've really known no different. And then like I look at people like yourself who have had the spinal cord injuries, um, and for me, like before I'd read that, I was basically, the frame of mind was, if something had been taken away from me, if I'd known, like for example, walking, and then
mm.
that had been taken away from me, and like those abilities lost, that yeah, I would have the same mindset that you did when you were reading about it before you had the accident.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think every person's experience of disability is obviously so different.
Mm,
And then every person who acquires an impairment and is introduced to the world of disability, I think has a very different experience as well to
yeah.
what I possibly have had.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And this is like something that I've spoken about before that's been twisted, I think, in interviews to make it quite inspirational, but I don't find it to be like an inspo thing. It just is what happened and is what sort of made me realize was about 3 weeks after I had my acquired my impairment. So I had
Can
my
I ask how
injury.
old you were when you had it?
19.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I was like still in hospital, like 3 weeks later, basically a news thing popped up on the TV that really showed a man that died instantly from the same sort of mechanism of injury that I had. So,
Right.
yeah, they like fell off a balcony really, and they died instantly. And that sort of put things into perspective for me where I was like, okay, like that's what could have happened. And I mean, obviously at that point you're like, oh, I've lost this, I've lost that. But I think the important thing that I would like to drill home for, whether it's for non-disabled people listening along or other people with disability who feel that they've lost things, for me, I feel like I've actually gained a lot of things as well, and possibly gained more than I've lost. So all of the different opportunities that I've had, and basically everything that I'm working on now has come from some form of like activism and experience of disability, and the sense of purpose that I have now as well in terms of like remolding the world and making things way more inclusive, is something that I would never trade just to be able to walk again. So I think, you know, and I don't know if you want me to jump into my 10 things yet. We might do that at the end. I don't know when you want to do it, but one of my things is basically that you should never assume that people with disability would prefer to be non-disabled or would want a cure. So like, you know, if someone came up with some miracle cure tomorrow that would make me walk again, I'm like, I don't know if I would take that, because it's a whole new process of like having to go back to that. I really like, most days I really like my wheelchair and wheeling around, and I can go really quick in my wheelchair. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm just going to clear my throat 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, talking about the 10 things, let's go into that now. So every week I ask guests about their 10 things that they'd like people to know about disability, which has been spawned from a blog post that I wrote that you can find on ainsleyhooper.com.au. So yeah, Jason, yeah, go through what your 10 things that you'd like to know, people to know about disability, please. Yeah.
It sort of comes down to me. I don't think I've got 10. I've got about like 6 or 7 that I jotted down.
That's cool.
If that's okay. But I think we could talk for hours about each one, to be perfectly honest. And we sort of have already touched on some of them. One of them was that basically never assume that all disabled people have the same experience of disability or just are the same. Like, don't just put us into a box and be like, they're all the same. Treat us all as individuals, because we are, and we all have very different experiences, as we've already touched on, whether it's from birth or an acquired impairment. You know, even within those two different categories, people have very different experiences as well. So treating us as individuals and respecting us for our own individual needs and wants and desires and things like that. So the second one is and I, you know, speaking generally, I can't speak on behalf of the whole community, but I know that I don't want non-disabled people to pity me. I would much prefer them to just create a world that is better for me and for all people with disability, rather than be like, oh, that must be so hard. Like, if you feel pity when you see me, it shouldn't be because of the fact that I have an impairment or that I'm a wheelchair user or that I can't walk. It should be because the world hasn't progressed yet to be inclusive and accessible to me. That's what you should be sad about, because that's the real shame, and that's the real thing that people probably should be ashamed about too.
Yeah, like, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think more people need to realize their own respective responsibilities in shaping the world in whatever way they can, whether they are a manager that has influence over employing people, you know, realizing your own responsibility there. So that's probably another point. Just come up with realizing your own responsibility around shaping the world around you.
Yep.
Yeah, the third one I've already spoken about is I don't wish that I was non-disabled. I don't imagine that I ever will. Obviously, I had moments like pretty immediately after acquiring my impairment, where I was like, this sucks, this is the worst. But now, about, I think even like 2 years after, I was pretty much like, this is my life. I love my life, and this is who I am. So it's integrated into who I am now. So to take it away from me feels wrong, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's quite a complex thing to explain, especially
It is.
I think
It's
if you
fascinating.
have acquired an impairment, because non-disabled people just think like, oh, well, don't you just want to get rid of it? And I'm like, no, like it's part of me.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting thing because, like, I mean, I grew up, wishing that I could walk with and like do other stuff, and then when I sort of as I got older, I'm like, well, the only reason I felt like that was because, like what you just said, like the world wasn't accessible, like
Literally.
like, and if the world if the world would be more accessible, then I wouldn't have to like have those thoughts, and it's just
Like
ridiculous.
95% of the challenges that I experience, again, I can't speak on behalf of the whole community, but 95% of the challenges that I face are because of the way that the world is structured, whether that's like the way that our systems, physical or not, are structured, or like the way that a space is built, or the perceptions of people, so then you don't get opportunities, or you come across someone that's super ableist in your day, or whatever, like can't reach something at the shops because that's a physical barrier, like 95% comes from the world rather than from
Absolutely. Yeah,
impairment or my
absolutely.
experience. So
Yeah, that's like because and I sometimes say it's, and the whole label of disability, and people saying that's another interesting one, being proud to say that you're a person with a disability, because the whole thing, and this was I sort of, it was before Stella Young. I sort of started following Stella Young stuff. Have you? Yeah, and talking about like the social model of disability as opposed to the medical, and that's where I think the big shift for me was like, okay, so it's not me. It's not that my condition needs to be fixed. Sure, if there was going to be a cure, it's awesome, but I mean, I'm 42 now and there hasn't been any kind of headway yet. So I'm not sort of holding my breath on it. So it's more about getting society to be accommodating to every single person. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think something that and like, this is not a comment on you or anyone else, obviously, I just speak for myself, is when I was thinking about whether I would take a cure versus, because in my brain, it's like, if I take that cure, potentially have way less influence in changing the world and making it more inclusive. There'll never be a cure for every single person with disability. Like, that just is never going to happen. Like, that's a very euphoric type world that people try to create and fabricate in their minds. I mean, like, we're struggling to create a vaccine for coronavirus at the minute. So I don't think we can just go like bang, bang, bang and create a cure for every sort of impairment or condition that people have. So, and we all naturally experience some form of disability or barrier when we age. So in my brain, I was like, taking the cure versus making the world more inclusive, I'm always going to choose the one that actually benefits more people, or
the
like
greater
everyone,
good.
the greater good, rather than like, oh, this one.
Excuse me, that's my dog.
That's right.
If anybody at home, that's my dog Sheldon trying to look at the screecher walking. Okay, let's just take a little intermission there. Oh, he's going to be featured on the podcast. Look at him.
Amazing. So I guess that thing that was in my head was a bit like, almost like taking that cure would almost be like a selfish way out of like fixing me rather than fixing the world. And then that comes back to that social model versus medical model, where it's like, I'm not the one that needs to be fixed. The world is. So like, people with disability don't need to be fixed. There's not like something that's like broken or wrong with us. It's just that the world needs to be more inclusive and accessible for us.
Yeah, and it's I'd love to sort of it makes me just thinking, just like, yeah, I think processing thoughts in my head makes me think like, I wonder when we sort of we've come to this shift of thinking about things like that. So for me, yeah, sure, I've had a disability all my life, but I didn't sort of have to rely on, yeah, I didn't have to rely on I guess, disability related things more so until later on in life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would say that I probably was relying on disability related things when I was younger, but they were just so incorporated into my life that I didn't know any different, and there was just sort of extra things that had to come into my life in the 20s when I had medical issues that were just snowballing. Um, and yeah, so that's when I felt more that I had a disability than previously. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of, it's a very interesting to think like, yeah, I am rambling at the moment, but yeah, it's just there's just so many thoughts that go through my head in relation to the whole thing. It's just, yeah, so I'm going to stop
Yeah.
rambling.
No, that's okay. Probably I'll go back to my points. The
Yes,
next one,
please.
because it's 10 things that I wish people realized, isn't it?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's like 10
So
things to know
one
about
is,
disability, and yeah,
yeah, cool, cool,
yeah,
cool. So a big thing that I have probably started talking about in the last 18 to 12 months
yeah.
is the systemic desexualization of people with disability. So I'm very
Yes.
passionate about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing that I would really want people to just go and educate themselves on, is essentially how we set up these systems and these structures, like
Mm-hmm.
social structures that
Mm-hmm.
value and devalue people.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be applied to a lot of different marginalized communities, but quite heavily for the disability community is that we are desexualized, which is
Yes.
why people have this strange thing where they come up to us in public and go, "Can you have sex?" And it's like, why would you ask me that?
Yeah. And
Yes, I can.
it's like my partner. I've been with my partner for 15 years, and people, I remember when we first started going out, people were like, "Oh, what disability does your partner have?" And I'm like, "He doesn't have a disability." Oh, I was so surprised, and it's
Well, how
like,
does that work?
yeah, like, but
Yeah.
yeah, and I remember like one woman, yeah, like just I had a carer come in. It's one of the very first times I used carers, and yeah, and this was before we moved in together, and yeah, that was what she said. I said, "Oh, I've got a partner," and she goes, "Oh, what disability does he have?" And I'm like, "He doesn't have one." She's like, "Oh, sorry." Like, it was just such a weird thing that
Yeah,
they
it
go
is
straight for
strange.
that.
See, that leads straight into my next point, which is
Mm-hmm.
about segregation. So,
Yes.
the point that I would make people take home is that we're not like special. We are like, I'm different to you. You're different to a non-disabled person. You're
Mm-hmm.
different to Stacey down the road, who may or may not be a person with disability. Like, we're all different. And obviously,
Mm-hmm.
we need to see and recognize people's differences in order to be able to cater to them. So we need to recognize disability essentially, so we can cater to it, make the word accessible and inclusive. However, disability is a very natural part of the normal spectrum
Yes.
of human diversity.
Yeah.
Like, all people are diverse, and
Mm-hmm.
disability is a normal part of
Mm-hmm.
that diversity, because
Yeah.
it's quite a complex thing. Because like, we need to recognize that it is a normal part of diversity,
Mm.
but we also need to recognize disability itself for the different challenges that people with disability have in order to make the world accessible and inclusive.
Yeah.
So that's a very important one I would like people to learn.
Yeah. I think as well, because I mean, when we talk about the autism spectrum, etc.,
Mm.
being autistic, people who are autistic don't see it, and it's not a necessarily a hindrance. Whereas someone with a physical disability like myself, people see it like that because you can't do
Mm.
things, but it
But the world should just be
and it's
structured in a different way so
and
that it's all
exactly,
equitable.
and that's what it is. I mean, basically, so having being autistic, your brain's just wired differently. So
Yeah.
having a physical disability, your body's just a little is different, and you need to
Yeah.
do things differently.
Yeah.
So just make the world
And
accessible
so
to
we
deal
should
with it.
recognize difference,
Mm,
but it should also, like, difference is normal. if that makes sense. Like, I don't love the word normal because I'm like, what is normal?
No,
But
I
the fact
hate
that
it.
everyone is different
Mhm.
is actually a very normal part of humanity.
Yes, exactly. That's what's normal. Yeah, accepting difference and making things accessible for difference.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. What?
exactly.
Yeah, because like it's funny. I was talking to a friend the other day, and we were talking about labels, like, and they were talking about the label differently abled, and I said, oh no, I'm not a fan of differently abled, because it's kind of to me goes down the whole inspo porn kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
That's a pretty complex one as well.
Yeah.
But I think the main takeaway from my perspective is, well, one, we've built a community around the experience and collective community that are people with disability. So that should never be diminished. Two, disability is, so when you look at the social model of disability, disability shouldn't be a word that we like shy away from, because it's not something that we as people with disability should be ashamed of. It's the rest of the world and the way that the social structures are set up and the way that physical structures are set up as well. That's what should be feeling the shame about it, because they haven't been set up and they're not willing to make those changes yet everywhere to make it more inclusive and accessible. So, because as we said, social model of disability is essentially that we are people with impairments or conditions, and then when we experience a barrier out in society, whether it's physical, social, communicative, whatever, that's when we experience the experience of disability. So
Yeah. So
when you
that's
look at it from that perspective, it's like, I want everybody to know what disability is so that we fix those barriers.
And it's such an interesting one, because I've started saying, because I used to not like saying that I was a person with a disability. I used to just be like, I'm Ainslee, I have spina bifida. That's it. And then, so I've now come to say, I'm a person with a disability. But the way I kind of identify, I'm Ainslee, I have a condition. The society is the disabler, but I am also a person with a disability. So that's that's complex. It sounds horrible.
But
Sounds
that's
horribly
also
complex,
like
but it's
the
just
really important part of the social model of disability is it's all inclusive, because if you don't want to own or have that as part of your identity, so if you don't want to be a person with disability, you don't have to say that you're a person with disability.
Yeah,
If you
exactly.
don't believe that you experience those barriers and that disadvantage and you don't want to have that as part of your identity, you don't have to. Whereas medical model, it's forced on you, because it's like, it's you. You're disabled. You're the disabler. Your condition, your impairment is the disabler. Whereas under the social model, so just imagine there were no barriers. I would just be Jason, who has a spinal cord injury and is a wheelchair user. I wouldn't be Jason, who is a person with disability. I would just be, that's my belief of social model anyway. So
and I think that goes back to where I was rambling earlier, because basically, and it makes more sense now, is that so I grew up with just Ainslee Ainslee with spina bifida, he uses a wheelchair, and then when I had those years in my 20s when I was sick and then had to rely on more services, etc., that's when I became a person with a disability, because I had to fit. And it was because I had to fit this particular tick box. I remember having to apply for services which I'd never had before, and it was mind-blowing that I had to, all these hoops I had to jump through, and basically I felt like I had to play my disability, not fake my disability, but I felt like I had to play the role of somebody with a disability that fit what they wanted. So to get these
100%.
services.
And that those structures still exist.
And I did. And the funny part about it was I didn't know how to end up getting the services, because at the time they said that, I mean, and it shouldn't have been, but I worked, like I was working, and they denied me based on the fact that I worked, which later on turned out to be completely irrelevant. It was apparently not meant to be that way, but that's okay. But it was just this whole process of it, like, yeah, having to play this part of what they wanted a person with a disability to be. And I'm just like, it was, yeah, to me, it was a disgusting process to have to go through. Because I was just like,
Yeah, it's all about
made me feel so
this whole
grimy.
like validation process of almost like, are you
Yeah,
disabled enough to have this service?
yeah,
Um, and it's all around like this whole severity of your experience of disability,
yeah, and
and
that's
that is very
disgusting.
medical model based, and those structures still exist everywhere
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
and it's one of the things that needs to be deconstructed and
Yes,
rebuilt with a more social model in mind, which is happening but slowly.
yeah.
But that's why these conversations are very important.
Oh, absolutely. Like it, yeah. I mean, and that's why I love these unscripted conversations, because that is such an important thing that I wouldn't never even thought to bring up. But yeah, like at the moment there is like, even with even with the new things that we've got, like within the government, etc. They talk about in the way of the societal social model of disability, but there is such a big medical model stereotype that's stuck in there, and that seems to be
Yeah.
what's actually holding things back and causing all the problems that we're seeing within those departments, etc. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's all about, yeah. When it comes to things like funding bodies and things like that, it's all about like how they do their assessments and how they tick those boxes to say yes or no to certain funding pools or dollar amounts, how they work out. So that's the part that's quite almost dehumanized and comes from a medical model.
Yeah.
And I'm not that high level of like a bureaucratic person, so I don't think that I'm probably the one that can provide the answers around it. But all I would say is that it needs to start coming from more of a social model,
Yeah.
which I believe, in my experience, I've seen some shifts, and I've seen some things that like certain programs and government organizations are doing, whether it's actually like part of the service they offer or whether it's like something that they fund or create, like
Yeah.
almost like a marketing thing, it's also still important. So
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to talking about the starting with Julius,
yep.
how did you get involved in that? Because that's so interesting. I only just saw on your Facebook page earlier that's one of your pages that you're involved in, and I've been like following it for ages, and I didn't realize you were involved in it at all.
Yeah, so they just reached out to me when they saw that I was modeling, which was cool.
Yeah.
And I connected with them, and so it's Angel Dixon and Katia Panetta. I think I have said Katia's name right. And they're both incredible advocates in the disability community and do some amazing things. So yeah, I just say that they came on as like my life coaches at one point and just really retaught me and helped me unlearn a lot of stuff around internalized ableism, which is one of my points, is that like most people with disabilities still experience internalized ableism.
Oh yeah, I do.
So it's okay for non-disabled people too as well. And yeah, so really they've just taught me a lot, and brought me different opportunities, connected me with, like for modeling jobs, like things like Target Australia and stuff like that. So yeah, so we've done a bit of work together, and really they just helped me work out what I was actually doing and what inclusion really is. And really it started off with, this is the social model of disability. So when people ask me where should they start, it's generally now we'll start with social model of disability and understand what that is. And then you can start having a few more conversations with me or with someone else around the different intricacies. But the main real thing is just to understand that social model.
Yeah, there was something you were talking about earlier about sort of talking about people pitying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and that to me is an interesting one because, yeah, people, I guess the reason people pity is because they don't see it enough, I think.
Yeah, and when they do see it, it's generally represented in a very medicalized or from a
Yeah.
non-disabled person's lens. So it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's already dictated to them that it is something that you have to pity because that's how it's shown on TV.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, I guess with my feelings about when I heard about your story, and I was just like, oh geez, like, if that happened to me, well, what my thoughts were when I
Yeah.
was, yeah, like, and yeah, I guess that need, well, I mean, yeah, it sucks. It sucks that the accident happened. I mean, so that part of it's, I guess, a normal pity reaction. But don't pity the person if they're doing okay.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's like it's probably like separating out like sadness and trauma versus pity, if that makes sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
trauma is a very natural part of life. Like we all experience trauma and sadness and
Yeah.
all that, although negative feelings are real and are a natural part of life. I was literally talking to my dad about this the other day about like obviously we all still experience some form of trauma of like what we as a family and me as an individual went through
Mm-hmm.
during the period of when I acquired my impairment.
Mm-hmm.
However, trauma isn't necessarily like validating. Like, I don't say that because I went through trauma, I don't say that that should allow a non-disabled person to pity me because of that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You can sympathize and empathize, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
difference between that and pity. And
Interesting.
it's all around the context as well. So you could sympathize with me because I went through a form of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
but don't pity me just because I use a wheelchair, if that makes
Yes.
sense. It's
Because,
a bit
yeah.
deeper than just like,
Mm.
because that's one thing that I get a lot is like, oh, I hear that you don't want people to like feel bad for you, but like we're just coming from a good place. And I'm like, that's fine. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
if I'm going through a shit time
Yeah.
or like if someone was going through something difficult,
Mm.
whether it's mental health, whether it's, something physical,
Mm.
of course you can sympathize with them,
Yeah.
but and offer them assistance or offer them like, your best wishes and things like that. That's
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah.
That's a nice reaction to have for someone, but to sit back and be like, oh my God, like, do you
So
know what I mean? It's a very different context,
so
pity
do you
versus
think
sympathy.
pity is more about feeling sorry for someone, but not thinking about the opportunities that somebody might have?
I think pity comes from the idea that disability is undesirable.
Yep.
And so a non-disabled person, when they look at a person with disability and pity them, what that says to me is, oh my God, I couldn't do that. Why? Like
Mm-hmm.
pretty much it's
Yeah.
like, I couldn't do that. Like I see that as less.
Mm-hmm.
I see you as having
Mm.
lost something. I see you as less than me. Therefore, I couldn't do that, and therefore, you're inspiring, or I feel so sorry for you.
Yeah. So they're not seeing past. They're not
A very
seeing.
underlying negative,
Yeah.
gross thing
Mm-hmm.
that presents as like a positive thing,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. Like it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm so sorry this happened to you.
Yeah. So
That
they're
feels like they're saying
looking.
something. They feel like they're saying something positive,
Mm.
because I can see that underneath that
Yeah.
is this whole thing where they're viewing me as less than,
Yes.
and that they're just feeding into the social structures
Yeah.
of the fact that people with disability are less than. That's the part where I go, I don't want your pity. I don't need your
Yeah.
pity. What I really need is for you to get over that and help
Mm-hmm.
me fix this world.
Yes. Yeah. So
Yeah.
they're not. So they're seeing a two-dimensional thing, and they're seeing what's right in front of them at the moment. They're not thinking about what the
Why?
possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
What? Why they're thinking that, and what the
Yep.
possibilities are. That that. And that, yeah, that's something I've asked people. I wrote a thing a while ago, and I've asked people, next time you, and it's hard to ask people to do something that they don't know they're actually doing, but ask
Yeah.
people to, next time you react to something, because I think I was getting a lot of I was getting a lot of comments on one of my Facebook posts, like, and these comments were not sitting right with me because they weren't what I was trying to convey in the post. So I was basically saying, so next time you read a post about disability, don't just say, go you, blah, 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 actually process it and your reaction, see what your reaction is and where your reaction is coming from, and then comment. But just don't don't look at it as inspirational off the bat, because too many people do that. They just look at things and it's just inspirational straight away, when I don't mind if some of my stuff is inspirational for people, but I want it to be inspirational for the right reasons.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
I definitely vibe with that.
Yeah, and that's
but
such a hard.
Just don't. Yeah, it can be very hard. But people just generally, a lot of people just don't question themselves. They don't introspect enough, so they don't go. They react to something or have an emotion like pity or like sadness, but they don't question. Okay,
where
that made me feel sorry for this person, but where does that come from?
Yeah,
that comes from this, but where does that come from? And drill deep down, basically to the point where it goes down to the social structures in society, because that's where it all comes from.
Absolutely.
Like you can pinpoint it all the time. You can basically pinpoint your whole kind of perspective of the world down to things that you've absorbed from the outside and put inside your brain.
Absolutely, yeah. Because like I've been thinking recently just about my childhood. I've written about stuff in the past, and I'm thinking about it more and more and more, and I'm drilling down, and there's actually more and more little things that I'm thinking, oh my God, that happened to me because that's what people thought was the right thing to do at the time.
Yeah.
Like that. So yeah, I'll be exploring that in further blog articles, but it's just a fascinating thing to think that things that you just put up with, that just you've figured, oh, that's just a part of life, and then you realize, well, they are a part of life, but they're a part of life because of the way people think and what was considered to be acceptable, and now it's not. And even not just in disability, just thinking about all the other societal issues going on at, like, in the last I guess maybe 10, 20 years, there's so many other things that have changed. That, and I'm watching TV, you watch old episodes of, say, Friends, and see some stuff in there, and you think, oh geez, that one couldn't fly now.
It's a bit like, that's not quite right, is it?
No. And it's like, and the funny thing is, like, Friends doesn't seem so long ago, but it's just, society's changed a hell of a lot since then.
And will continue to as well, but definitely the representation that we see in our media and things that we consume in high levels, which is like your TV and your film and your music and those sorts of things, and now podcasts and things, it's the representation has to be there, and in those realistic and positive, empowered ways to create the change. So that's what I'm all about.
Yeah. I wanted to just ask you as well, because I know when you said so you were studying medicine. What were you studying? Like, how far were you into it? And what were you actually studying to do?
So it was a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery at Monash Uni, and I got to the end of second year.
Yep.
Which was interesting.
Yep. And so have you thought of, like, going back into medicine kind of thing? Like, or?
No, yeah, I sort of, from that 2 years, I think I find, like, physiology really interesting. But there's a lot of things that I find interesting that I wouldn't want to devote my life to. So at that point in my life, that was, my pursuit of medicine, I think, was based on very naive and probably, I would say, materialistic and capitalist, probably, views of the world that I had when I was younger around, like, what success really is. Basically, success was just, probably, to really simplify it down, which is probably not doing my younger self justice, but to really simplify it down, it was basically like being very smart and being very rich. And obviously, like, and this still exists everywhere, but being very beautiful. So And those three things still exist everywhere, but
Yeah.
I am now conscious of unlearning them. So
yeah. So what's important to you now then, like between then and now?
like in terms of what, like how do I define success?
Yeah. What would you define success as now?
Probably like, I would say probably finding the thing that or finding things that you're actually passionate about, and then creating some sort of life, career, whatever you want to call it, where that is included, and then having like a balance between that and, you know, the things that you love doing and the things that you find fun, whether that's hanging out with friends or whether that's, you know, playing video games or watching movies or whatever it is. Creating the balance, and that's probably how I define it now.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and it's been interesting since COVID, and like to think it's like been 6 months since like the lockdown and all that stuff, and like even since then, like things have changed so much as to what, you know, we thought before was important as to now. Yeah, it's even just in this short time, it's been interesting to see what's changed in.
Exactly.
Yeah, like for you, what has anything changed in what you think is important between March and September?
I don't think too much has changed in terms of like what I view as important, because I think I'd possibly learnt some of like possibly the things that non-disabled people or whoever else have learned during this period. I think I might have already possibly learnt them, if that makes sense.
Like, I've just realised how
like self-care and stuff like that. I learnt that like after I had acquired my impairment, I learnt a lot about self-care and things like that then, and knowing your limits and, you know, making sure that you're kind of filling up your cup or whatever you call it, that sort of stuff is really important to me to stay motivated and dedicated and determined and all that kind of stuff. So I think people are getting around that a lot more now because it's such a tricky time and we're stuck at home and all this time and things like that. So
so I think that's like for me, basically, I mean, I've always been an introvert, so I've always liked being at home, all that kind of stuff. But but just in this last 6 months, it's just the little things that we used to do, going out, I realize I don't miss all these little things as much as I used to, as much things that I took for granted. I don't miss as much, and I could actually do without. And it's just like, you know, things that, you know, you just used to do, I could like, it doesn't matter if I do them anymore. But yeah, for me, like going back to the gym, can't wait for that to happen.
Yeah, definitely. Having that, I guess, having that back to the routine that I really love and accessing those, like going out for coffee and stuff, will be really nice to start doing that a lot more. There's just those certain little things that we love because they fill up our cup because we love them. Like going out for coffee and having ridiculous chats with my friends and catching up and just being silly. That gives me energy so that I can keep going to do the things that, you know, the things that I still love, but are like probably more considered my job and work and career and stuff. So, and gym is possibly one of those ones for you. So
and it's like just like I've got a coffee in my hand right now. My partner, he bought a different brand of coffee a few weeks ago, and I went to the kitchen and I smelled it, and it's like I was in a cafe again. I was just like, oh. And I said to him, I hadn't realised how much I'd missed that smell. Like, just
it's nice to mix up your coffee beans every now and then, isn't it?
Yeah,
just try something new.
And I haven't. I'm sort of new to coffee, and I'm probably doing a very sinful thing at the moment. I have Milo in my coffee at the moment.
Mocha, yum. It's almost like a mocha.
It is basically, and so I'm doing very sinful. I haven't graduated to a black coffee yet. I only have milk coffee. I'm
an almond milk latte kind of guy.
Yes, almond milk's not too bad, but I prefer to have the real deal if I can.
Yeah, nice.
Oh, thank you very much for chatting with me today.
No, that's all right. Did you have any other questions at all? I feel like I don't know. Did I bring enough to the table?
You did, absolutely.
Thank
Where
you.
can I don't have any other questions. I know I will think of them after because I always watch these back and
Possibly.
think like, oh, okay. So I certainly will have you on again at some point. Where can people find you and follow you and all that stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So on Instagram and Facebook, I'm called My Life with Wheels, and obviously my name's Jason Clymo. So just double check that you found the right person. And then if someone's listening to this and they're wanting to hire me as a model or any of that stuff, they can find me at Wink Models, and you just jump on their website and search in Jason Clymo. But yeah, for everything else, like whether it's inclusion work. Or if you need any like marketing agency services, my marketing agency is called J2 Content Creation. That's got Instagram and Facebook as well. Just trying to think what else I do. They're probably the main things really that people might be looking for, but
Wow,
yeah.
cool. I do have to
Yeah.
say that when I keep with your name, I keep going with Brett Clymo. Do you know who Brett Clymo is?
No.
Okay, do you remember Country Practice?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so Brett Clymo was a doctor on a country practice.
Like a
So
character, or was he an
yeah,
actor?
yeah. So he's an
Oh,
actor.
cool.
Sorry, no, Brett Clymo is the actor's name. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah,
There you
so
go.
every time I think Jason Clymo, my brain first goes Brett Clymo. And like, no, that's not it.
Well, you've done very good. You haven't called me Brett once,
No,
so
good.
good job.
Oh, excellent. Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I'll look forward to chatting again to you at some time.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you and thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. All right, I'm going to stop recording.